Okay, so we are at 1 Peter chapter 2, and I'm going to go ahead and walk through what I took away from it earlier when I read it, and share that with you. So, if you remember at the end of 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter talks from basically verses 13 through 25 about how to, as believers, how he calls them to change their attitude, their mindset, their behavior, because they've gone from a non-believer to followers of Christ. And so at the beginning of chapter 2, he continues that theme, and he gives them more action points of where to go. So he says, look, instead of living out of the ways that you used to live, you were full of malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, slander. Put all that away, because those are ways of the old world. Those are the ways of the old you. You are a new creation, and so you do not have to live that way. In fact, just like a newborn baby, what you should do is, as you're weak and dependent, just like newborn babies are dependent on their mothers for food and care and everything in the beginning of their life, so should these new believers long for spiritual milk, so that by that they can grow up, just again in that metaphor of humanity, grow up into salvation. If indeed you have tasted, there's the reference again back to the idea of spiritual milk, tasted that the Lord is good. And then Peter goes on and says, as you come to God, who is a living stone, rejected by men, you yourself are like a living stone, and you're being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. There's some reference to Old Testament ideas. To offer spiritual sacrifices, again Old Testament, acceptable to God through Jesus Christ, except now instead of the priests being select folks and spiritual sacrifices being specific types of sacrifices at specific times, done in specific ways, now the people themselves are being built up in that way. Again, just a description of how the old and the new blend together and yet are different at the same time. So that you offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. He goes back and references Isaiah and talks about laying a stone in Zion, a cornerstone. The cornerstone, of course, in a building is the main building stone, the one that all others are built off of, and says Jesus is that cornerstone. And whoever believes in Jesus will not be put to shame, or will not be found that what they believed or who they followed after was wrong. That's amazing stuff. And then he says, honor comes to those who believe, but for those who don't believe, they will stumble. And then he goes on to talk again about that stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and the stone of stumbling. And it says that the non-believers stumble because they disobey the word. So this cornerstone, this idea of stumbling over something, they stumble over that because of being disobedient. And then he goes on and says, but the people of God are chosen, a royal priesthood, we heard that before, a holy nation, a people for God's possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of God, who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So he says again, you have been people of darkness, but you were called out, and that you and I should proclaim that transformation and call it excellent. Say it's an example of the excellence of God. Because once you were not necessarily all put together in one people group, but you are now God's people. You hadn't had mercy come to you, but now you have received mercy. You've been saved eternally through Jesus Christ, and so God's mercy has fallen on you instead of judgment. He then urges them as folks who are away, as we are spiritually away from God's kingdom physically, but are waiting for the opportunity to go back, or go to our home, our spiritual home. He says, while you are away from heaven, abstain from the passions of the flesh. Things that drive you inside of you, those things that are inside that wage war against what God wants. And all of us have a different things that we war with and war against. And all of us have differences as far as the passions of what is inside that fights against that. He says when you're with other folks, when you're with those who are from other places, or maybe this could be non-believers, he says be honorable. Be honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, and in that sense they're lying, right? They may see your good deeds and glorify God. So even if they speak against believers, the believers can say with confidence that they know that what they were doing and who they've been has been honorable. And then he goes on and talks about subjecting themselves to legal authority, or he talks about the idea of servanthood, and even though that's not political authority in that sense, there was obviously some aspects of authority, as a servant was subject to their master, so the master had authority over the servant. And he says, but even though you are being subject to those different groups, the emperor, the governor, the master, he says in verse 16, live as people who are free. So he says, even though you're subject to these different folks, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. And so he says, even though you may be politically obedient, even though you may be treating your master, whether they're good and gentle or unjust, treat them with respect. And he says, and at the same time, realize that you are free eternally because you are living as a servant of God. So even though we have a servant and are under the authority of God, he provides that servanthood in a way that we can consider ourselves still free. He says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor. Those are really 4 interesting statements to put together. So honor everyone, obviously, this idea of treat everyone as worthy of honor and respect. Again, even those who may be against you. That turning the other cheek idea, this love others, the golden rule and things like that, that definitely speaks to that. Love the brotherhood. In that sense, he may be talking about other believers, and treat the folks who are other believers with you, and love them, treat them with honor and respect, even though those may be people who, believers can obviously get on the nerve of other believers. But love them regardless. Fear God with this holy fear, and then honor the emperor. So he speaks to a variety of touch points that we may have in our life, from the touch points here on earth, as well as the connection that we have with God. He goes on and talks about servants and masters, and digs into that a little bit. Talks about how when folks are under the rule of someone who's unjust, that even though you endure unjustly, that Jesus also endured unjustness. Goes on in those middle sections to 21, 22, 23, 24, and even into 24. And he compares Jesus and describes how Jesus suffered, and even though he wasn't worth all the punishment he suffered, he endured unjustly. And yet Peter talks about how it was unjust because the way that the person of Jesus was perfect, that there wasn't any deceit, that he didn't revile others in return, he didn't threaten, but he continued entrusting himself, and this is verse 23, Jesus continued entrusting himself to him, God, who judges justly. So even though he was being judged unjustly by people here in the world, the Pharisees and the others, the Roman rulers that eventually sentenced, and Hebrew leaders who sentenced Christ to death, Jesus continued to entrust himself to God who judges justly, so we should also. And then he finishes by saying in verse 25, "For we were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd." Obviously there's lots of parallels with the Gospel of John, and the language of sheep and shepherding in John 10, for example, talks about that. And then the overseer of your souls. So we were gone. We were straying like sheep on our own, blind and foolish, and yet have returned to the shepherd, who is God the Father, who oversees, takes care of, and directs the path, knows the way of our soul eternally. So those are some of the things I took out of chapter 2. Hopefully that is interesting to you, and obviously share what you may have taken away from chapter 2 in the comments below. You can like, subscribe, or comment. That helps me to get more viewers, and I hope that this has been helpful to you, and we will see you soon with 1 Peter chapter 3. See you then.